Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. Thank you so much for joining us here at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church for Sunday School. I'm glad that you've come along as we get this bird's eye view of the books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament or the First Testament, whatever one wants to call it. We've made our way now into the major prophets. Last week we looked at Isaiah. Today we'll be looking at Jeremiah. Jeremiah is an unusual prophet, sometimes called the weeping prophet, but there are a variety of different things that we want to look at today as we think about the word of Jeremiah to us today. The first is Jeremiah's call. The Lord calls Jeremiah in a relatively unusual way in Jeremiah 1:5. He says, "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I chose you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you to be a prophet to the nations." This is a very interesting call because it indicates that the Lord had called Jeremiah before the day that he was even born. He had been appointed to be a prophet to the nations. And you can note, just by way of small ancillary excursus, that this passage indicates that Jeremiah was a person before he was born. And that's very clear here in this passage. There are other kinds of passages like this when Jesus jumps in his mother's womb, or John the Baptist jumps in his mother's womb when Mary comes near. It's indicative of the fact that John the Baptist is a human being, a person, despite the fact that he's not yet born. Without getting off into a whole rant about that, I think that at least ought to give us pause when we think about when life begins. One can argue that, well, this is some kind of special language or some kind of literary device, and perhaps it is. But it seems to indicate that there was humanness before he was ever born. This is a picture of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is he's telling us that we are awful people, and yet God loves us anyway. And he does that in a variety of ways. In this picture, you can see that there's a jury there, so that reminds us of Jeremiah. But Jeremiah is standing there in his prophet's clothes, and he's holding up a rotten, stinking piece of cloth. And so we have here him holding up this cloth or this belt as evidence of Judah and Israel's great problems. And one of their great problems, in fact, perhaps their most significant problem, is that they have followed after other gods. And so this book is in many ways autobiographical, a collection of Jeremiah's speeches and sermons talking about God's judgment. And God pictures the moral rottenness of his people through the picture of this sash. And Jeremiah he's engaging here in an acted parable. And this sash or this cloth, there's some dispute about exactly what it is. It smells terrible, it's rotten, and it's a picture of what's going on with God's people. So Jeremiah engages in these acted parables, as do many of God's prophets. We'll see it in Ezekiel, and you'll see it in a variety of other places. But in Jeremiah 13, at the beginning of the chapter, God asks Jeremiah to go out and buy a cloth or a sash or a pair of shorts, it might be like in today's parlance. It's hard to tell exactly what it is. But he buries this cloth in mud near or in the river Euphrates. There's some kind of a place there that he buries it. Now this immediately raises some problems for us because the river Euphrates was hundreds of miles from where Jeremiah lived. So it's possible that he made a long trip to bury this sash and then another long trip to go and dig it up. But it's also possible for the Hebrew text, if there's a bit of a textual issue there, and the word that's used there can also be translated as the name of a town. And the name of a town is one that's near Jerusalem. So it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on there, but he buries this cloth either somewhere near the river Euphrates or somewhere else. He buries it, and then he comes back after what the text says are many days, and he finds the cloth there ruined and of no value. It stinks, it's rotten, it's dirty, it's beyond being cleaned. There's nothing that can be done to make this cloth what it once was. And Jeremiah says then that these people of Israel are becoming just like these linen shorts or this linen sash or cloth or whatever it is. They are good for nothing. And that's why in Jeremiah 13:10, the text very clearly says that Israel, that's the they here, they are becoming, because of their idolatry, because of their running after other gods, they are becoming just like this piece of cloth. That is, they are absolutely worthless. And so it's an acted parable. Sometimes we think of parables as being spoken. Jesus tells stories, and Nathan the prophet tells stories. And that's what we think of as a parable, and those are parables, no doubt about it. But we should also think of this as not just parables, not just as being spoken, but also as being acted out. There are other places that we'll see. And you can remember a variety of times when Jesus acts out parables. The cleansing of the temple, I think, is an acted parable. Jesus is saying that this whole temple is going to be destroyed just like I've knocked over these tables, and you need to find some other place where you're going to have to turn for forgiveness. And there are a variety of other places. Jesus, when he curses the fig tree, it's another acted parable. And so there are a variety of times in the Bible when people don't just tell stories, but they act out these stories so that it will be memorable. It's almost like what we would call today a children's sermon. It's not just something that you say, but it's an object lesson in a way. And I've had people say to me sometimes that sometimes they remember the children's sermon more than they remember another sermon. And what they mean by that, it's nothing mean, but what they mean is the object helps them to remember what it was that they were really after. And so today, all of us need to remember that Jeremiah holds up that rotten sash, and he says if we are following after other gods, if we are looking for our substance in some other place, then we're going to be awfully, awfully sorry. We're going to be useless, just like that cloth. And so these other acted parables that we have seen, they're to remind us of what God is doing for his people, in his land, and what he is doing with his people today. There are a variety of different examples that I could give you of Jeremiah's message, but this is one of them, and I think this is indicative of what's going on. Jeremiah says, "Do not chase after other gods until your shoes wear out and your throats become dry. But you say it is useless for you to try and stop me because I love those foreign gods and I want to pursue them." So there you see very clearly, Jeremiah is saying the biggest problem that we have right now is idolatry. And I keep trying to say to you again and again and again, don't keep chasing after those idols. And you just keep on doing it. I don't know what to tell you, he's saying, but you just keep on doing it. And when I tell you to stop running after the other gods until your shoes wear out, until you're so thirsty that you can't stand it, you tell me, he says, you people to whom I'm speaking, you tell me that you love the other gods and you want to pursue them. One of the big questions about Jeremiah has to do with exactly what's going on when he's writing and all of that. So we know that the book was written by Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, and Jeremiah is sometimes called the weeping prophet. He is not happy to deliver a message of God's judgment to them. Be careful of anyone who seems thrilled to deliver a message of judgment, because God is not happy to have to judge his people. It is necessary, just like a parent punishing their child. It's necessary. But the parent who is happy to punish their child, there's something wrong with them. And the person who is happy to bring a message of judgment, there's something wrong with them. And Jeremiah was the premier prophet of Judah during the last days before they were destroyed. And he keeps telling them, this is going to happen. This is going to happen to you. You've got to listen to me. This is going to be a serious problem. You've got to listen to what I'm telling you. And they just don't do it. Jeremiah, in some sense, was a blazing torch who, along with Ezekiel in Babylon when they were in exile, he exposed the darkness and the terror and the awfulness of the sin of Judah. They knew better. They knew better than to go out and search after other gods, and yet they kept on doing it anyway. Jeremiah's ministry extended, from what we are able to gather, from the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, so we have a place where it is started, until the exile of the Jerusalemites. So we have a beginning and an ending point. He prophesied from about 627 until about 586, or some would argue even maybe 582 or 580. But his book, Jeremiah, he includes a large number of chronological references. The problem is that the book is not written in a chronological fashion. And so you have early chronological reference, late chronological reference. This chart will help you to see a little bit about what I'm talking. And you can see, I hope, that what's going on is that in Jeremiah chapters 1 through 6, it seems to be written during the reign of Josiah. Then chapter 7 through 10 seems to be written long after Josiah has died. Then chapters 11 and 12, we're back to the reign of Josiah. And you can see, by the way, that this line goes up and down almost like a heart monitor, that we can't read Jeremiah as if it was written beginning in Josiah, and he starts with Josiah at the beginning of his book and then ends at the exile at the end of his book. That's when he was prophesying, but his book is not written in that way. There are problems with the unity of this book. And as you can see from the chart, the major difficulty lies in trying to determine how the various prophecies in the book of Jeremiah were compiled, because there are a variety of them, and they give these specific historical incidents, but they're all over the map, going up, here, this time, that time. And so it's very difficult to tell. And some have argued that the speeches of Jeremiah were simply collected together, and there's no real order or unity. Somebody just took speeches, wrote them down, collected them into a scroll, and that's the way they are. I don't think that that's the case. I think that rather than saying there's no real unity or order, we can remember three things. One is that Jeremiah is not written chronologically. All of us can recognize that. There's no sense in which the book of Jeremiah is written in a chronological order. No one today would argue that. No one who reads the book of Jeremiah with ancient history in the back of their mind would argue that. That's just not, it's not the way that the book was intended to be read. And if we try to impose that onto the book, then we do damage to what the author wanted. A second thing to remember is that his messages were given during times of difficulty and stress and times when people wondered whether they were going to make it or not. They had faced so many problems in their land, and they knew that there were other countries and other big groups of people who were thinking about joining together and deciding whether or not to take them over. It's a very stressful time. Imagine, if you can, the kind of stress that was on the people who lived on the east coast of the United States during the Civil War, when there were thousands of people being killed and homes being burned down to the ground and all sorts of things going on like that. And you just never knew. If you lived in a particular area, you never knew for sure what might happen to your home, to your belongings, to anything like that. It was a time of terrible stress. And the third thing that we should remember is that the book itself gives us some examples of when Jeremiah was collecting his sayings. So there are times when this book was smaller. It had a smaller number of sayings. And Jeremiah went out and prophesied more. He collected more of his sayings, and he put more of those sayings into a book. And as a result of that, the book grew. And you can see that in the passages that I have for you there, 25:13, chapter 30, verse 2, chapter 36, verse 2. It's times when Jeremiah is either rewriting or regathering or gathering for the first time the sayings that he has been engaged with. What is exactly the message of the book? Jeremiah is the second of the major prophets. Isaiah was the first. Remember that major doesn't mean more important. It only means that they are longer in length. So Jeremiah 52, if you read it, is almost identical to 2 Kings 24:18 through 25:30. That is, the ending of 2 Kings is almost identical to the ending of Jeremiah. And that indicates to us that there was probably an editor or a writer who compiled the books of Kings and who perhaps compiled the writing of Isaiah. And so we should realize that having an editor gathering things up in no way denies the inspiration of the text. Clearly in the New Testament, there are people who wrote things for the Apostle Paul. Paul would, for example, say things, and there would be someone who was his amanuensis or his secretary who was writing these things down. We know that for certain. And that's, in all likelihood, the same sort of thing that's going on here. And internally, the nation of Judah was gripped by idolatry, as we've already seen. They are the rotten sash. They are the idolatry that King Manasseh had promoted. The king had promoted idolatry during his long reign. During a reign of 55 years, he had promoted idolatry. Then the boy king, Josiah, found a copy of the law in the foundations of the temple. As they were trying to rebuild the temple or repair the temple, they found a copy of the law. And Josiah read that and became very convicted about the idolatry that existed during that time. And so he broke down all of the idolatrous places, all of the idolatrous kinds of places where people would go and give worship to other gods. And as a result, idolatry went down during the time of Josiah. Unfortunately, after he died, the king and the people, their hearts turned back to going to idolatry. And so it's a terrible kind of thing to realize that Josiah had pointed them toward reformation. He had told them that what they were doing was not good, and yet they had gone on and done it anyway. In terms of structure and style, there are 4 things that are evident in the book of Jeremiah as we look at it. And if you take the time to read the whole book of Jeremiah, this will be evident to you as well. First is that there's a lack of chronological arrangement. As we remember that chart that we saw a few minutes ago, there's no sense in which Jeremiah can be read as a chronological type of book. And a second thing is that this is autobiographical in nature. Jeremiah tells a lot about himself, a lot about what he was doing, and a lot about the great and amazing sort of work that he was putting in to try to keep these people away from foreign idols, and yet they were doing it anyway. And there are different literary materials. That is, there are different kinds of pieces of literature in. There are speeches in Josiah. There are historical confirmations of things in Josiah. There are prophecies in Josiah that if they don't stop this idolatry, they're going to go into exile. All of these things happen in the book of Jeremiah. Sorry, I think I said Josiah a moment ago, but you know that I'm speaking about the book of Jeremiah. And then there's a logical arrangement of material. That is, rather than chronology, Jeremiah uses a logical method to fit his material together. So people often want to take the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and force them to fit together into some kind of a chronology. And for example, they ask the question, when was the temple cleansed? At the beginning of Jesus' ministry or at the end of Jesus' ministry? When did this happen? When did that happen? Because the synoptic gospels will often have small variants about things like that. And we shouldn't let that sort of thing bother us, because sometimes the books are not written to cause us or want us to read them chronologically. That's not why what they're doing there. And those who want to impose some sort of a chronology upon a non-chronological book, they do damage to the book. They cause it to be not what it should be. And so we should think carefully about that ourselves. There's a structure and style in Jeremiah that when we say outline, it's really the barest of outlines, because it's not as if Jeremiah is saying, this happened in AD 600, this happened in AD 580, this happened in BC 600, BC 580, BC 550. That's not the way that it works. But this is a very basic outline. The first is Jeremiah's call. In the first 19 chapters of the book, you will find Jeremiah talking about God having called him. That's the first chapter. Then Jeremiah begins to talk about the downfall of Judah and what's going to happen as a result of Judah not following after God, and of Judah following after the horrible idols that they were doing. Then Jeremiah shows Judah that they have a couple of alternatives. Either they can turn away from those idols, or if they don't turn away from those idols, they're going to be going into exile. They're going to be punished greatly by God because of what they have done. And then Of course, remember that in chapter 52, this is a historical epilogue. It's just sort of wrapping up the book of Josiah in the same way that the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is wrapped up at the end. And I just want to give you now just a few verses from Jeremiah that I think will be helpful to you as you go about your week. First, Jeremiah says that God is saying to Judah, "My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and they have hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Remember that Israel is a dry place. And remember that one of the ways that they were able to collect water was to have a stone cistern, a stone sort of a bowl, great big bowl, where they would catch rain. And then they would save that rain in there, and they would have it for during the dry periods when they needed it. And Jesus says to the woman at the well the same sort of thing that Jeremiah says to us here, that there is living water and that any of us can be a partaker of that living water, but not if you're going to try to get water for yourself. You can do one of two things. You can either try to run your own life by digging out cisterns for yourself, or you can allow God to give you the living water. Hollowing out cisterns for yourself has the problem of the cistern being broken. And when the cistern is broken, the rainwater doesn't collect inside this big giant bowl. It just runs right down where the brokenness is. But it's not just brokenness that Jeremiah talks to them about. He also says that there's hope. He says there's hope for your future. That is, their exile will not last forever. The problems that they are facing will not last forever. There's hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. That is, even though you're going to be exiled, the Assyrians are going to come and take you away and burn down your houses, take you into a foreign land. That won't last forever. And it's something that we can be reminded of as we face the difficulties in our own culture and in our own country today. That these problems with the pandemic and other kinds of things, they will not last forever. Finally, Jeremiah says, toward the middle of the book, "I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." The tree may look like it's about to die right now, but there are a few green leaves still left on it. And out of those few green leaves will come hope. Out of those few green leaves, remember last week when we talked about Isaiah, there is a root left, and out of that root will come a tree, and out of that tree will come the Messiah. So despite the difficulties that we face as the people of Judah face the problems of their own sin, we can today remember that God has great plans for us, and He is the one who will give us our welfare. He is the one who will plan for us, and He is the one who will give us a future and a hope. And so this week, I hope that you have a hopeful week, and that the prophet Jeremiah reminds you of just how much hope there is in our God and our Father and in our Messiah, Jesus Christ. We'll see you next week as we go through these books of the Bible, and I hope that the Lord blesses you as you learn more about His Word. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks for attending Sunday School at Coal Ridge Presbyterian Church.